started like it always does, with the small things. They never feel important at the time, just little moments that you brush off or laugh about. But looking back, I realized they were warnings, clues that something was amiss. I ignored them all. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood, one of those streets where everyone knows each other, and you leave your doors unlocked during the day. People have lived here for decades. Their kids grew up here, and it's safe. Safe enough that I never thought anything bad could happen here. But there's always been the whistling. Every night at exactly 3:03 a.m., it starts. A soft, cheerful whistle. It drifts down the street like the echo of someone just out for a nighttime stroll. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. The same tune over and over, always from the same direction. I only hear it when I'm in the kitchen or the living room, and it fades as quickly as it comes. If you've lived here long enough, you learn not to pay attention to it. That was the first rule of the neighborhood. Don't look. No one ever explained why, but everyone knew. You don't open the blinds, you don't peek outside. You just pretend it's not there, and everything is fine. At least, that's what we told ourselves. But something happened one night. Something I hadn't anticipated. I was staying up late, lost in a movie marathon, when I saw it. From the corner of my eye, a shadow crossed the window. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but then I noticed the curtains had been drawn just enough to see outside. I froze. The whistling, it was louder than I'd. First, I thought it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light, or my own tiredness playing with my mind. But the shadow was there, fleeting but real. It passed by the window slowly, too slow for just a tree branch swaying in the wind, too deliberate for an animal. I froze. The whistling was louder now, clear and cheerful, cutting through the silence of the night. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. The sound carried a strange sense of familiarity, like a song from childhood you half remember. My heart was pounding, but I told myself not to be ridiculous. It's just the wind or a passerby. Don't look. That's the rule, the one everyone follows. But it was impossible to ignore the shadow. I stood from the couch and moved toward the window, slowly, almost unconsciously. My hand hovered over the blind's cord, every instinct telling me to stop. I knew what the neighbors said, what everyone always warned about. Whatever you do, don't look. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the blind up, just an inch. There was nothing, just the quiet street, empty as always. The shadow was gone, and the whistling, it had stopped. Relief washed over me, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something had changed. I let the blind drop back down and turned away from the window, convinced that I had overreacted. I glanced at the clock, 3:05 a.m. on the dot. As usual, the whistling only lasted 2 minutes, not a second more or less. But that night, something lingered. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I could feel it. Presence. Like the night itself was watching me, waiting for something. I eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, my dreams filled with fleeting images of dark figures moving just out of sight. The next day, things seemed normal. The morning light chased away the heaviness of the night, and the usual hum of neighborhood life carried on. But I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. I told myself I imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew better. That night, as 3 a.m. approached, I found myself wide awake, listening for the familiar tune. When it started, I resisted the urge to get up. Don't look. I repeated the rule in my head, a mantra to keep the temptation at bay. The whistling moved closer, louder, until it was right outside the house. And then, it stopped, earlier than usual. No fading away down the street, no gradual disappearance. Just silence. I waited, heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear anything, even the faintest whisper of sound. But there was nothing, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. I glanced at the clock, 3:04, 1 minute early. That had never happened before. The routine was always the same. The whistling came and went at the same time, like clockwork. But this was different. I couldn't resist anymore. I got out of bed, slowly walked to the living room, and stood in front of the window, the same one where I had seen the shadow the night before. My hand hovered over the cord again, my breath shallow and quick. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity, but something compelled me to pull the blind up. I peered outside, just a crack. There, standing in the middle of the street, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light, just the outline of someone standing perfectly still. No movement, no sound. The whistling didn't start again, and the figure didn't walk away. They just stood there, facing the house, their presence an eerie silhouette against the night. Suddenly, the figure turned its head, just slightly, as if it knew I was watching. My stomach lurched, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I dropped the blind and stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside felt like a threat. The feeling that someone, something, was watching me never left. And worse, I knew I had broken the rule. I had looked. The next day, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt off. It was subtle. People were still out walking their dogs, trimming their hedges, and chatting with neighbors. But there was a tension in the air, something unspoken but shared. I noticed the glances, the way people seemed to hesitate before greeting me. It was as if they knew. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Palmer, usually waved and made small talk when I passed by. But today she only gave me a quick, tight-lipped nod before hurrying inside. The kids across the street, who always played on their bikes in the cul-de-sac, were nowhere to be seen. The whole street felt off-kilter. I spent the day trying to push it all to the back of my mind, but the nagging unease stayed with me. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see the figure again. But the day passed without incident. By the time night fell, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been in my head. Almost. At 3 a.m., I was wide awake again, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The minutes ticked by, and right on schedule, the whistling started. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. But this time, it wasn't outside. The sound wasn't drifting down the street like usual. No, this time it was closer. Inside the house, started faint, like it was in another room. My heart froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whistling grew louder, slowly, deliberately, moving through the house, from room to room, passed by the kitchen, the living room, and then it stopped right outside my bedroom door. I lay perfectly still, my mind racing. Don't look, don't look. The rule echoed in my head, but this was different. This wasn't outside the house anymore. It was inside. There was no sound, just the deafening silence that followed the whistle. My eyes were fixed on the door, expecting the handle to turn, expecting something. But the door stayed closed. And then, just when I thought it was over, there was a soft tap, tap, tap on the door. A polite knock, as if whatever was outside was waiting for an invitation. My blood ran cold. I stared at the door, willing it not to open, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I stayed like that, frozen in my bed, too terrified to move, for what felt like hours. When the morning finally came, I opened my eyes. The house was quiet, normal. But I knew things would never be normal again. I had looked, and now, it was inside. The next few days felt like a haze. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. My once familiar and comforting house now felt like a stranger's home. Every corner shadowed, every creak filled with a hidden malice. The whistling hadn't returned, but that was somehow worse. It was like the calm before the storm, an uneasy quiet that promised something darker was yet to come. People in the neighborhood avoided me. I could feel it in their sidelong glances, the way conversations abruptly ended when I approached. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken suspicion, and I was becoming the outcast of my own street. I didn't have to ask why. I knew they had noticed something too. One afternoon, as I was walking back from the mailbox, I caught sight of my neighbor, old Mr. Thompson, standing on his porch. He was usually friendly, always ready with a story or two about his days in the army. But now he just stared at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. He didn't say a word, just slowly shook his head before turning and going back inside. I stopped short. Everyone knew the rules. Don't look. And I had broken them. But it wasn't just guilt that gnawed at me. It was the growing realization that whatever was happening wasn't over. It had only just begun. That night, the tapping came again. I had been lying in bed, restless, my thoughts drifting back to the figure I had seen through the window. That's when I heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap against the glass. I froze, my body going rigid as my heart leaped into my throat. It was coming from the bedroom window, the very one I had looked through just nights ago. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly, almost involuntarily, I turned my head toward the sound. The blinds were down, casting the room in deep shadow, but I could feel it. Something was there, just on the other side of that thin layer of fabric. Waiting, watching. A shiver ran down my spine, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me, as if it could somehow protect me from whatever was out there. Don't look. The rule pulsed in my mind like a drumbeat, but the temptation was unbearable. Just one glance, just to confirm that it was nothing, that I was safe. But I knew better. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like it knew I was trying to resist. Tap, tap, tap. My breath hitched, and I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blanket over my head like a child hiding from a monster. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint creak. The sound of the window shifting slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The house groaned with the weight of the night, every noise amplified in the oppressive quiet. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, just outside the window, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. Look at me. I bit down on my lip, hard enough to taste blood. The voice was soft, almost sing-song, but there was an underlying malice in those 3 words. The urge to obey was overwhelming, a primal compulsion that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. My hand gripped the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. Look at me. I didn't move, couldn't. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the window, like something had slammed into the glass with terrifying force. The whole house seemed to shudder with the impact. My heart stopped, and I let out an involuntary gasp. My body curled tighter into itself, and I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to drown out the sound, trying to make it all go away. But it wouldn't. The banging continued, rhythmic and brutal, shaking the window over and over. I thought for sure the glass would shatter at any moment, that whatever was outside would force its way in. And then, just as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I stayed curled under the blanket for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too afraid to open my eyes. I waited, listening for any sign of movement, any sound that might indicate that it was still out there. But there was nothing, just the soft ticking of the clock on my nightstand, counting down the minutes to dawn. When the first slivers of daylight finally crept into the room, I dared to peek out from under the blanket. The window was intact, the blinds still drawn. But something was different. I forced myself to sit up and approach the window, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. As I pulled the blind up, a cold chill ran through me. There, smeared across the glass in long, dark streaks, were what looked like handprints. They were faint, but unmistakable, like something or someone had been pressed up against the window during the night, trying to force its way in. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. My body felt cold and numb, and I struggled to process what I was seeing. The handprints didn't look quite right. They were too large, too distorted, as if the fingers had been elongated, stretched in a grotesque imitation of human hands. I felt nauseous. This was real. It wasn't my imagination. Something had been out there trying to get in, and it wasn't finished. The next morning, I barely left my room. I felt drained, like something vital had been taken from me during the night. I tried to convince myself that it was all some elaborate hallucination, that I was stressed or overtired, but deep down I knew better. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my nerves still raw from the night before. When I opened it, I found a small group of neighbors standing on my porch, looking concerned. Among them was Mr. Thompson, his usually stoic face etched with worry. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice low and serious. The others nodded, their faces tight with unease. I let them in and we gathered around the kitchen table. They explained that they knew something was wrong, that everyone on the street had felt the shift since that night, since I had looked. "What did you see?" Mrs. Palmer asked, her voice trembling slightly. I hesitated, unsure how to explain the figure, the whispers, the handprints on the window. "It's hard to explain," I finally said, but they didn't seem surprised. Instead, they shared knowing glances, as if they had heard it all before. "We've seen it too," Mr. Thompson said gravely. "The Whistler. You shouldn't have looked." "I know," I whispered, my throat dry. "But what is it? Why does it?" He cut me off with a grim shake of his head. "We don't know what it is. We only know that once you've seen it, once you've broken the rule, it doesn't leave you alone." The air in the room grew colder, heavier with the weight of unspoken fear. Whatever was out there had noticed me now, and it wasn't going to stop. I had broken the rule, and now I had to live with the consequences. The neighborhood meeting ended with more questions than answers. The group left quickly, their words weighing heavy on me. It felt as if they knew more than they were willing to share, and the vague, cryptic warnings did nothing to quell the dread coiling in my chest. But the one thing that stuck with me was Mr. Thompson's last words before he walked out the door. "It never forgets. Once you've looked, it's part of you." I spent the rest of the day in a daze, wondering if there was any way to undo what had been done. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside sent my heart racing. The hours dragged on, and when the sun dipped below the horizon, my dread returned with full force. I dreaded nightfall like never before, because now, I knew it was more than just the Whistler's eerie tune that haunted our street. Night came, and with it, the familiar whistling. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. I sat on the couch, staring at the front door, waiting for it to pass. But something felt different. The sound didn't fade this time. It lingered, hovering outside the house, teasing me with its cheerful melody. It wasn't moving on. My pulse quickened. I clutched the arms of the couch, fighting the urge to glance toward the window. And then it stopped. For a moment, silence fell over the house, thick and suffocating. My body went rigid, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. "Don't move. Don't look." But then came the sound I had been dreading, the soft, insistent tap, tap, tap against the window. This time, it wasn't coming from the living room. It was coming from my bedroom, the one place I had always felt safe. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever it was no longer content with lurking outside. It was coming for me. With my heart pounding in my chest, I crept toward the bedroom. Each step felt like a lifetime, the weight of the air pressing down on me as I neared the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, hesitating for a split second before turning it. The door creaked open, and the room was bathed in darkness. The whistling started again. This time it wasn't distant. It was inside. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. I felt it, something in the room with me. A presence so thick, it was as if the shadows themselves had taken form, watching, waiting. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, lurking in the dark corners, inches away from where I stood. I stepped forward, straining my eyes in the dim light. As I approached the window, the whistling grew softer, almost a hum. And then I saw it. Pressed against the glass were two faint handprints, just like the ones I had seen the night before. But these were fresh, as if someone or something had been standing there, waiting for me. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward. But before I could move any further, a soft voice, barely more than a whisper, echoed through the room. "Look at me." The same phrase, the same sickly sweet voice. It was coming from the corner, where the shadows seemed to thicken, forming the outline of something tall, thin, and wrong. I froze, my entire body paralyzed by fear. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes drifted toward the corner of the room where the figure stood, shrouded in darkness, its features just out of focus. But there was something horribly familiar about it. The shape of its face, the way it tilted its head slightly, almost curiously. Took a step forward, and I could see it more clearly now. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins snaking beneath the surface like a network of black roots. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach turn, were its eyes. They were my eyes. The figure stepped closer, its hollow, mocking grin widening as it loomed over me. The room seemed to warp around it, the air growing colder, suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was rooted to the spot, my legs refusing to move, my body betraying me. The figure leaned in closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin. "You looked," it whispered, its voice dripping with cruel delight. "Now you're mine." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The warnings from the neighbors, the strange occurrences, the figure outside my window. It wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something worse, something that mimicked. It had watched me for days, learning, imitating, waiting for the moment I would break the one rule that kept it at bay. And now that I had looked, it had become a part of me. With a burst of desperate energy, I broke free from my paralysis and bolted toward the door. The figure's laughter echoed behind me as I tore through the house, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air biting at my skin. I collapsed onto the front lawn, staring up at the darkened windows of my house. There was no sign of the figure, but I knew it was still there, lurking, waiting for me to return. I didn't. I drove to the next town that night, too terrified to stay in the house any longer. But even as I left the neighborhood behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The figure had followed me. I could feel it watching, always just out of sight. It's been weeks now, and the whistling hasn't stopped. Every night, no matter where I am, I hear it. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. Sometimes it's faint, other times it's right outside my window. And with it, I hear the soft tapping, the same voice whispering those cursed words. "Look at me." I don't know how much longer I can resist. It's getting harder every day. The figure, my shadow, it's always with me now, waiting for the moment I slip up, the moment I give in. But the worst part is, I'm starting to see it everywhere. In the reflections of mirrors, in shop windows, in the corner of my eye when I pass by a darkened room. It's always there, a reminder of the rule I broke. And now, I realize something terrifying. It's not just after me. I'm becoming it.